The final cut to black in The Sopranos has been sold as Ambiguity, which in practice has meant an entire cottage industry of theories, some plausible, some indulgent, and some so eager to be clever that they forget the show's greatest trick was making ordinary selfishness look like destiny. For all the attention lavished on glamorous culprits, Furio returning from exile, stray Miami associates, a vengeful remnant of Bobby's Canadian hit, a conveniently resurrected interior decorator, or a youthful hanger-on whispered into relevance by sheer boredom, one suspect keeps standing in the background, with the patience of a man who understands how power actually changes hands. Patsy Parisi. This is not a theory built on novelty, and it does not need novelty. It is built on the show's most reliable engine: insult, resentment, opportunity, and a leader who cannot stop manufacturing enemies as if it were a renewable resource. Patsy's motive is neither speculative nor subtle. His twin brother is murdered on Tony's orders, and the show refuses to treat that as a closed account. Patsy's grief is not a single episode accessory. It is an undertow that resurfaces precisely when the narrative wants to remind the audience that this world does not forgive, it only delays. The backyard scene, Patsy drunk, armed, and staring at the boss with a moment's worth of lethal clarity, functions as a promissory note. He does not pull the trigger. Instead, he chooses humiliation, urinating in Tony's pool as if to underline the point that the impulse is real, but the timing is not yet correct. That decision is not mercy, it is strategy. Killing a boss is not a tantrum. It is a career move that requires cover, plausible deniability, and a system weak enough that it cannot immediately avenge the offense. The series also treats Patsy with a restraint that is easy to misread as insignificance. He appears often, speaks rarely, and is granted less overt development than the show's more theatrical disasters. That restraint is not neglect, it is camouflage. The Sopranos trains attention by rewarding viewers for watching the spectacle, then punishing them for missing the people who survive it. Patsy and Carlo Gervasi occupy a similar narrative niche: constant proximity, minimal exposition, and a persistent sense that they are being kept in reserve because loud men make noise and quiet men inherit whatever is left. The final stretch makes a conspicuous point of reminding the audience that these background figures still exist. Carlo is brought forward through the blunt instrument of legal peril. An attorney warns Tony that Carlo intends to testify. Patsy is brought forward through positioning, visibility, and survival. In the Blue Comet and the chaos that follows, Patsy is present when the hit on Silvio occurs and escapes. That escape is important because it is just plausible enough to pass as luck while feeling almost too tidy, as though someone knew exactly where to stand and when to move. The Sopranos is not a show that fetishizes action choreography. When it draws attention to someone's survival, it is usually doing narrative work. By that point, Silvio is arguably the last major figure whose loyalty to Tony reads as more than procedural. Paulie has always been a survivor first, a loyalist second, and a moralist never. His history with New York includes feeding information with the kind of deniable innocence that only the truly shameless can perform, and his resentments accumulate in the open: hostility toward Christopher, irritation at being overshadowed, and the perpetual grievance of a man who believes respect is an entitlement rather than a consequence. When a crew is reduced to a leader, an ailing loyalist, a potential informant, and a veteran opportunist, the question is not whether betrayal is possible. It is which version of betrayal will arrive first. If Patsy is to act, that is the moment. The New York conflict produces the ideal cover: chaos so thick that attribution becomes optional. This is where the talk of ambiguity becomes more interesting than the binary question of whether Tony lives or dies. The usual audience interpretation treats ambiguity as a yes or no scoreboard, because viewers are trained to demand finality. A more plausible reading is that ambiguity concerns agency and context. Tony can be killed without the series providing a diagram of who, how, and why, because the show's point is not forensic closure. It is inevitability produced by a corrupt ecosystem. The conflict with Phil and the New York crew creates precisely the kind of turmoil in which a rival within the family can place a hit and let the larger war absorb the blame. Once that frame is adopted, the Patsy theory becomes less a conspiracy and more an exercise in narrative realism. The looming marriage between Patsy's son and Tony's daughter is not merely a domestic subplot. It is access. In a world where business is conducted through family, becoming family is not a sentimental arc. It is an information pipeline. A prospective son-in-law learns plans, routines, and meeting places. A prospective father-in-law learns even more. The location of a family dinner is not innocent data. It is operational intelligence disguised as normal life. The marriage plot also creates a psychological layer that is either chilling or darkly comic, depending on how much faith remains in anyone's capacity for decency. The show invites the question, does Patsy truly reconcile with the man who ordered his twin's death? Or does he merely accept the social convenience of proximity until proximity becomes useful? In this environment, bygones are not bygones. They are debts. The sacramental language of matrimony, when applied to a criminal dynasty, becomes almost satirical, holy vows serving as the wrapper around a strategic merger. Patsy's hostility is sharpened by the contrast between his own restrained competence and Tony's escalating malignancy. Tony's family life is a perpetual performance of authority without responsibility. His reactions to loss and suffering are filtered through image management. A mother's death becomes a stage for resentment. Christopher's demise becomes a springboard for self-indulgence. Bobby's killing registers more as tactical inconvenience than human catastrophe. And even his son's suicide attempt is framed as a social embarrassment as much as a human emergency. A man watching this from close range is not simply witnessing a flawed boss. He is watching the collapse of any pretense that leadership is anything other than appetite. This is why the theory also benefits from the show's obsession with echoes and foreshadowing. Tony himself articulates a principle that becomes a thematic boomerang. When a leader fails to address an insult properly, he creates the conditions for his own assassination. The comment about Carmine Lupertazzi failing to make the Ginny Sack humiliation right with Johnny Sack is not merely gossip. It is a thesis statement about disrespect and consequence. In that light, Tony ordering the death of Patsy's twin is not just business. It is a foundational insult left to rot. Patsy's warning to Gloria, delivered with controlled menace, his face would be the last one she would see, not Tony's, and it would not be cinematic, operates as a signature line and a meta-commentary. The finale, with its refusal to stage a glamorous execution, becomes the visual answer to that promise. The audience sees Tony's face, mundane and unheroic, and then nothing. Those demanding cinema miss the point. The show's aesthetic is anti-operatic. It punctures mob mythology by denying the audience the catharsis it thinks it deserves. The repetition motif, the idea that things come in threes, further strengthens the narrative logic. Tony survives lethal intent more than once. Threats from within family, violence from a relative, peril from enemies. A third strike is rarely treated as another escape in stories that care about pattern. Patsy, too, is framed as a man who nearly acts again, and then finally acts when conditions align. Whether specific claims about earlier opportunities are perfectly cataloged is less important than the structural message. Deferred violence is not abandoned violence. Of course, a theory that feels inevitable can still be undermined by careless details, and the Patsy case is not immune to that. Assertions about crew assignments, who belonged to whose crew, whether Patsy and Eugene shared a direct chain of command, whether Patsy served under Gigi, are contested by those with sharper recall of the series' internal bookkeeping. That pedantry is not entirely frivolous. Overreaching on facts hands critics an easy dismissal. Yet the broader point survives taxonomy. Eugene's death, regardless of administrative placement, embodies the boss's indifference to a subordinate's humanity. Tony denies a man's exit, the man destroys himself, and the organization treats it as collateral. That is the kind of moral atmosphere in which even competent insiders conclude that new management is not merely desirable, but necessary. That environment also explains the most common practical objection. If Patsy wanted Tony dead, why wait so long? Because waiting is what survival looks like in a hierarchy where killing a boss is both sacrilege and professional suicide. In this world, there are rules, and even men who break them respect them selectively, because the rules are scaffolding. A spontaneous assassination invites immediate retaliation from within the organization and from external allies who fear precedent. By contrast, acting during a war, when leadership is already destabilized and attribution is muddy, is not only easier, it is safer. It is the difference between personal revenge and institutional transition. This is where Polly and Carlo become useful, not necessarily as co-conspirators, but as illustrations of how fractured Tony's support base has become. Polly emerges relatively unscathed, which is either a sign of luck or a sign of alignment with the winning side, two concepts that, for Polly, are nearly identical. Carlo's potential testimony is an overt threat, and the show is shrewd enough to use overt threats as misdirection. If Tony is consumed by the obvious problem, the man with a lawyer and a federal pathway, he is less likely to notice the quieter problem, the man standing beside him in the everyday scenes, the one who already proved he can aim a gun at Tony and then decide to wait. Carlo's situation is also plausibly self-contained. A son facing serious prison exposure can motivate cooperation without any need for a grand pact. Indeed, a sober point arises here. If prosecutors are pursuing Tony, Carlo may rationally want Tony alive long enough to trade meaningful testimony, and a dead boss can complicate the leverage of cooperation. The show's world is messy enough that multiple motives can exist without converging into a single, neat plan. Agent Harris is another invitation to excess. His move from organized crime to terrorism, his growing familiarity with mob figures, and his flashes of fascination and jealousy are real thematic material. Institutional drift, moral contamination, and the voyeurism of authority watching outlaw freedom. That does not automatically make him an intermediary in a grand plan to remove both Phil and Tony, but the possibility exists because the show has already illustrated that lines blur and favors circulate. The more credible use of Harris in this framework is not that he masterminds anything. It is that he exemplifies how even the formal structures of law can become emotionally invested in outcomes, and emotionally invested institutions create informational leakage. The Patsy argument becomes even more compelling when viewed against Tony's record of leadership as a catalog of ruined lives. Tony kills a close friend who betrays him, and then performs grief as self-justification. He undermines his own consigliere by elevating a favored protege for sentimental reasons. He drives away valuable allies through intimidation and jealousy. He orders the elimination of a young woman after exploiting her vulnerability and forcing his surrogate son into impossible loyalty. He kills that surrogate son after years of grooming him as family, and then treats the aftermath as license for indulgence. He destroys civilian lives with casual cruelty, a childhood friend bankrupted, a cop's career wrecked, a string of peripheral casualties who learn that crossing Tony can be punished even when Tony pretends to feel guilty. He picks fights poorly, chooses sides badly, and leaves his organization weaker with every act of self-preservation disguised as authority. The sheer accumulation matters, because a boss does not need one enemy to die. He needs enough enemies that someone eventually decides the risk is worth it. This is why Tony's repeated decision to pass Patsy over for advancement reads as more than bureaucratic detail. Early on, Tony elevates Christopher, his heir apparent, over steadier men. Later, even as the organization is understaffed and bleeding, Tony leans on Polly, a man with his own entrenched interests and a long record of self-serving conduct. The fact that Tony can even dangle Patsy's name as a temptation to Polly, using Patsy as a bargaining chip rather than as valued leader, only reinforces Patsy's standing as the competent subordinate perpetually denied recognition. In the moral economy of the show, that is the kind of slight that becomes lethal when combined with an older, deeper grievance. The surrounding commentary that treats Patsy as one of the few non-failures in the crew is therefore not mere fan admiration. It is part of the logic. Patsy is credible precisely because he is not a clown. He blends in, looks like a middle-class father, wears the unremarkable costume of a man who can stand in line at a store without attracting notice. From the North Ward Merchants Cooperative to the shoelace bacteria rumor, Patsy's ordinariness is part of the menace in plain sight. The series even leans into this realism by surrounding him with eccentrics: Silvio's theatricality, Polly's superstition, Christopher's volatility, so that his plainness reads as competence rather than emptiness. Some of the side debates only further illuminate the show's moral logic. The question of whether Patsy and Carlo raised their sons better than Tony did is a fine example of how quickly nostalgia can substitute for evidence. Their sons are hardly model citizens. They orbit criminality with a predictability that does not reflect especially enlightened parenting. The more defensible observation is that their relationships with their sons appear, at least in limited glimpses, less volatile and less poisoned by the particular psychological wreckage Tony carries. Tony's bond with his son is strained not because his son is uniquely defective, but because Tony is a man raised by instability, a violent, neglectful father, and a corrosive, manipulative mother. Expecting emotional fluency from that foundation is like expecting a clean bill of health from a diet of cigarettes and denial. The Beansy episode, with its $50,000 payment, is another instructive parallel, because it shows how Tony frames coercion as generosity. The money is not justice, it is a settlement, a quasi-court judgment in the mob's shadow government. Accepting it signals closure, compliance, and the end of claims. Refusing it keeps uncertainty alive, and uncertainty is treated as threat. Tony's satisfaction afterward is not relief that harm has been repaired. It is relief that his conscience has been bribed into silence, and his authority has been reaffirmed. This is the same moral logic that makes the Patsy theory plausible. In Tony's world, closure is purchased, not earned, and those who refuse to be purchased become problems. Even the more dismissive retorts, complaints that the argument runs too long, that it sounds paid by the word, that a cookie can sometimes trigger nerves and vitamins can trigger groans, and that no two theories can be gathered even with computers, accidentally vindicate the show's design. The Sopranos encourages proliferation because it refuses to sanctify a single reading, yet it also punishes careless readings. If an argument becomes a marathon without discipline, it starts to resemble the very character flaws the show satirizes: obsessive, defensive, and desperate to turn chaos into a sermon. The remaining objections tend to reveal more about expectations than about the series. Why did Patsy not simply walk into the pork store with an automatic weapon and cut down the entire crew? Because this is organized crime, not a revenge fantasy, and wholesale spectacle invites wholesale retaliation. Why did he not shoot Tony in the backyard? Because that would have been an act of grief, not strategy, and grief is punished. A boss's murder requires cover, consensus, or at least plausible deniability. Acting during wartime provides all three, especially if the hit itself is staged with a degree of theatrical incompetence that invites confusion. A man sitting in a restaurant long enough to be seen, behaving less like a seasoned professional and more like someone whose frame of reference is borrowed from movies. That oddness can be read as evidence of an amateur, a proxy, or simply the show's insistence that death does not arrive with perfect choreography. The point is not that every logistical question has a single answer. It is that the environment is ripe for a move against Tony, and Patsy is the character with motive, proximity, and the demonstrated capacity to wait. In the final accounting, the appeal of the Patsy hypothesis is that it requires no cinematic heroism and no elaborate outsider villain. It requires only that the series' most consistent pattern, Tony's inability to protect, reward, or even respect the men who serve him, eventually produces a practical response. Patsy is the embodiment of that response, quiet, competent, aggrieved, and positioned close enough to know where the target will be. The New York conflict supplies the smoke. Carlo's legal crisis supplies the distraction. Polly's ambiguity supplies the sense that loyalty has become performative. And the family marriage plot supplies the access that makes a chance encounter at a diner feel less like chance. The finale's darkness is therefore not a coy refusal to answer. It is a refusal to flatter. If Tony dies, it is not because the universe needed a twist. It is because the universe Tony built finally behaves exactly as it has been trained to behave. It consumes its center, quietly, without ceremony, and without granting the audience a glamorous killing, refusing to explain in the way a lesser show would. That refusal is precisely the point. Ultimately. Subscribe.